I have always believed that Oxford has its own way of remembering. Its bells, solemn and indifferent, repeat themselves with a persistence that outlives us all. On the evening when this case began, I was standing on the edge of Broad Street, listening to the old sound of St. Mary's chimes, each stroke falling as if the city itself wished to remind me of how little men matter against the long procession of time. Rain had been with us all afternoon, a listless drizzle that varnished the cobblestones and pressed the air into a kind of muffled silence. It was late September, that uneasy interlude when the colleges prepare for the arrival of fresh faces and yet still linger in the somnolent quiet of the long vacation. I remember thinking how curiously bare the quadrangles seemed, stripped of laughter, as if waiting for some undisclosed event. I had been walking without purpose, or perhaps with too many purposes, and found myself drifting toward the Radcliffe camera. There is a satisfaction in moving nowhere in particular, provided one has the illusion of deciding it. The bells tolled again, echoing faintly through the mist. Bells that announce beginnings, endings, funerals, marriages. That evening they seemed to suggest only absence. It was there, leaning against the iron railings that surround the Bodleian, that Lewis found me. His arrival was as dependable as the rain, a dark coat, a look of earnest patience, a quietness that carried its own reproach. He said there had been a call from the porter's lodge at St. Anselm's. A body had been found, and could I come? I nodded. There is something about death in Oxford that never feels accidental, no matter how ordinary its mechanism. The city itself turns conspiratorial. The shadows in the cloisters lean closer. The stones seem to have overheard too much. We walked together through the wet streets. Lewis told me, in his subdued way, that the deceased was a lecturer, a certain Dr. Adrian Kynaston. His name was not unknown to me, a man of mild renown, a scholar of medieval theology, who occasionally published pieces in the journals no one pretends to read. Single, late 50s, given to a life of ascetic routine, as far as anyone knew. He had been discovered in his rooms by a scout who had come to set the fire for the evening. The night porter was waiting at the lodge. His hands were restless upon the wooden counter, polishing an already polished surface. He explained that he had seen Dr. Kynaston enter the college gates around 5:30, carrying his usual leather satchel. There had been nothing remarkable in his manner, though the porter admitted he had not looked closely. We crossed the empty quad, the drizzle making pale halos beneath the lamps. I have always been struck by the peculiar intimacy of college staircases, the faint odour of wood polish and old books, the echo of shoes on stone. They remind one less of institutions than of enclosed lives, stacked vertically, each behind its discreet oak door. Kynaston's rooms were on the second floor. The scout, a thin man with watery eyes, stood anxiously in the corridor. He whispered that the fire had not been laid because he had seen the body and retreated in fright. Lewis gestured for him to wait, and together we entered. The room was small, orderly, and unwelcoming, as though its occupant had never truly inhabited it. Books lined the shelves with military tidiness. A kettle sat cold upon the grate. At the writing desk, beside a neatly sharpened pencil, lay the body of Dr. Kynaston, slumped forward upon folded arms as if exhausted by some final note-taking. His face was pale, the lips tinged with blue, eyes half open in a look of tired inquiry. There was a smell, faint but sharp, of almonds. I felt the deduction before I thought it was cyanide. The detail had been hiding there, waiting for someone to breathe it in. Lewis moved to check the pulse, though it was unnecessary. On the desk lay an empty teacup, its porcelain rim carrying the trace of a man's last gesture. Nearby was a small brown bottle, uncorked, its labels scuffed beyond legibility. It would have been easy to call it suicide. Indeed, the arrangement suggested nothing else. But I have learned to distrust the obvious when it arrives so quickly. My gaze moved to the bookshelves, the clock upon the mantel, the leather satchel slouched in the corner. It was there, in that satchel, that the first whisper of unease took shape. The satchel was dry, though he had carried it through rain. Too dry, in fact, as though it had not left the room at all. A small contradiction, but enough to nudge me into that alertness I know so well. Lewis muttered that the college had already informed the coroner. There would be an inquest, of course. He asked if I thought it was suicide. I told him we should wait before deciding what a man intended. Death is seldom so transparent. While Lewis noted the obvious details, I found myself drawn to the penciled words beneath Kynaston's hand. A crossword, half completed, the kind one finds in the Times. The last entry attempted was 5, down, unyielding bell sound, 4 letters. He had written toll and left the final square blank. A small oversight or something larger? The clue seemed to echo the bells I had heard earlier. Toll. The missing letter, the incomplete gesture, unsettled me. I left the room with the sound of rain dripping from the gutters. The scout looked at me with frightened expectation, as if I might tell him whether the world was still dependable. I gave him nothing. Outside, the quad was darker now, the lamps throwing small islands of gold into the mist. The bells rang again, fainter this time, as if calling from another century. I felt the weight of their echo in my bones. Was it suicide? Perhaps. But the dry satchel, the crossword, the scent of almonds, these things had already conspired against certainty. Oxford remembers. It reminds me too much, and I, whether I wished for it or not, had begun to remember it. There are evenings in Oxford when the air itself seems intent on preserving secrets. The drizzle had thinned by the time Lewis and I left Kynaston's rooms, but the mist still clung to the lamps, weaving the quads in pale gauze. St. Anselm's looked more like a monastery than a college that night, its stones subdued, the ivy dripping in silence. I thought, not for the first time, how every wall here bore a memory, and how easily the present is swallowed by the weight of the past. Lewis had gone ahead to make notes with the porter, leaving me to wander the cloister alone. The flagstones were slick underfoot. I heard the faint echo of my steps, irregular, as though the stones were reluctant to carry the sound. A bell from some distant chapel rang 7, and I recalled the crossword clue on Kynaston's desk, unyielding bell sound. Toll. The missing letter troubled me still, a small absence that felt larger than the man who had left it unfinished. Perhaps it was nothing. Yet I have never trusted anything. I paused by a notice board pinned with curling announcements, concerts, tutorials postponed, a lecture on medieval heresies. Kynaston's name appeared once, attached to a talk scheduled for next week. The paper had been thumbtacked neatly, no sign it had been meant for erasure. If he had intended to die, would he have arranged his commitment so tidily? I could not say. Some men make lists for themselves even as they stand on the brink. Through the glass of the porter's lodge I saw Lewis seated stiffly, his notebook open, listening as the porter recounted his small portion of the day. I watched the porter's hands, broad and worn, shaping the air with slow gestures. There was nothing guilty in them, but perhaps something rehearsed. I left them to their ritual of question and answer, and instead walked toward the chapel. The chapel doors were ajar, as though reluctant to close against the mist. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of old wood and candle wax. A single lamp glowed above the lectern, leaving the pews in shadow. I have always found that chapels feel lonelier and unoccupied than when filled with prayer. On the altar lay a hymn book open to an evening psalm. Someone had been here recently. The page was still slightly bent, as if by a lingering hand. I remembered Kynaston's reputation as austere, solitary, a scholar of texts so ancient few cared to read them. Yet here was a trace of life, the hymn book disturbed, the faint echo of use. Did he sit here before drinking from that poisoned cup? Did he ask some silent question of the stone saints before returning to his desk? The thought unsettled me more than the body had. Suicide is one thing, ritual another. When I emerged, the quad was darker. Lewis joined me, his notebook tucked under his arm, his expression carrying that mix of resignation and perplexity I knew so well. He said the porter had confirmed Kynaston's habits, regularly as bells, so he called them. Breakfast at 8, lecture notes until lunch, tea at 5. Always the satchel, always the neat stride across the quad. Nothing had seemed unusual. I told Lewis about the dry satchel. He frowned, said, perhaps the porter had misremembered. Rain makes us all liars, he said. I let it rest. There was no need to press him. Contradictions show themselves best when left unattended. We stood for a time beneath the arch that opened to the street. Students would return in a week, their chatter filling these stones. Tonight there was only the drizzle, the hush of old walls. I told Lewis I wished to walk the perimeter before we left. He sighed, but followed. The gardens behind the college were thick with wet leaves. A few benches glistened under the lamplight, empty as confessionals. The library windows were dark, but I noticed one upper window slightly ajar, as though closed in haste. A trivial observation, perhaps, but in such small things unease grows. If Kynaston had been so ordered, why leave a window gaping to the rain? I paused under the chestnut tree by the gate, its branches heavy with water. A scrap of paper clung to the wet grass, half muddied. I bent to retrieve it. A torn page from a notebook, faint pencil lines still legible. Only 3 words remained: unblurred bell, steadfast toll, another echo, another fragment. I showed it to Lewis. He shrugged, saying it might belong to any student. Yet it had lain too close to Kynaston's path, from the lodge to his rooms, for me to dismiss. We left the college at last, the porter locking the gate behind us. The sound of the bolt sliding home felt final, as though sealing more than stone. We walked without speech toward Cornmarket, the mist loosening into rain again. Lewis muttered that the coroner would not look kindly on speculations about torn papers and dry satchels. He was right, of course. But then the coroner's duty is to close questions. Mine has always been to open them. That night I sat in my room with a whisky and replayed the day. The bells tolled again across the city, and I thought of Kynaston's crossword, that missing L, so slight and so insistent. I thought of the satchel too dry, the open hymn book, the paper sodden in the grass. Each was a bell stroke in its own right, echoing faintly, refusing to be silenced. I had no theory, only fragments. Yet fragments have a way of arranging themselves if one waits long enough. Outside, Oxford lay in its damp hush, the colleges breathing secrets into the mist. I felt them pressing in, waiting. Twilight had passed into night, and with it, certainty slipped further away. Still I knew that a man does not leave a crossword unfinished without reason. A man does not carry a dry satchel through rain. And bells do not toll without echo. It was Lewis's suggestion that we spend a while in the senior common room before leaving St. Anselm's for the night. He argued it would be useful to speak to anyone who had seen Kynaston earlier in the day, and though I doubted the likelihood of uncovering anything more than gossip, I agreed. There is a kind of truth that lingers in rooms after their occupants have left. Sometimes it is found not in words, but in silences, in the way a chair is left askew, or in the scent of smoke that refuses to disperse. The common room lay on the first floor of the south wing, its windows looking out upon the rain-darkened quad. We entered through a heavy oak door that creaked as though reluctant to admit us. Inside, the air was thick with the stale perfume of tobacco and old sherry. A fire burned low in the grate, its embers murmuring softly, as though unwilling to draw attention to themselves. The room seemed deserted at first, but then I noticed two figures seated in armchairs by the fire, shadows carved against the lamplight. One was the college bursar, a wiry man with silver hair, and an expression permanently tinged with irritation. The other, younger and more distracted, was a junior fellow whose name I struggled to remember. They looked up as we entered, their movements measured, as though we had disturbed a ritual. Lewis introduced us with unnecessary formality, and I found myself sinking into one of the leather chairs, its cracked surface sighing under my weight. The bursar spoke first. He said he had not seen Kynaston that day, though he had passed his rooms around 3 o'clock and heard the faint scratch of a pen. That was nothing unusual, he added, with the air of one accustomed to routine. The junior fellow murmured that he had glimpsed Kynaston in the hall at lunch, eating alone, as always. He thought the man had looked pale, though Kynaston always looked pale. Beyond that they could offer little. Lewis pressed them gently, his questions practical, his voice steady. I let him proceed, preferring to observe. The bursar's hands, long and bony, never ceased their restless movement, fingering the stem of his glass, polishing the invisible. The junior fellow, meanwhile, stared into the fire, as though waiting for it to reveal something he could not name. I asked him, almost idly, whether he had ever joined Kynaston for a meal. He hesitated, then said no, not once. It struck me as curious that a man could spend decades in a community, yet remain untouched by companionship. The fire cracked, and the bursar remarked that Kynaston's lectures had grown shorter of late, his voice trailing off into muttered digressions. Some wondered if he was unwell. I filed this away. Illness could explain pallor, distraction, perhaps even despair, yet I recalled the dry satchel, the crossword, the torn scrap by the garden gate. Illness does not arrange contradictions. After a time, the bursar excused himself, leaving us with the younger man. The shadows lengthened in his absence, the room growing quieter. I asked the fellow what he studied. He said Renaissance poetry, though his tone suggested little enthusiasm. He mentioned that Kynaston had once corrected his Latin in a corridor, unsolicited, and that he had avoided him thereafter. There was no malice in his words, only a faint discomfort, the memory of a man who could never quite belong. I stood and walked to the mantel, where a row of pipes rested in a rack, each worn by years of use. One was missing. I asked whether Kynaston smoked. The fellow said never. He was almost ascetic in his habits. Then whose pipe was absent? The bursar's, perhaps. Yet the absence felt untimely, as though someone had left in haste. A small deduction, unprovable, but enough to stir my thoughts. Lewis suggested we leave. I lingered a moment longer, staring at the darkened windows. The rain had begun again, tracing slow patterns on the glass. I thought of Kynaston, seated alone with his crossword, the missing letter waiting like an unanswered question. I thought of the satchel too dry, the hymn book bent by a recent hand, the paper sodden in the grass. Each fragment belonged somewhere, though the pattern remained concealed. As we stepped into the corridor, I heard the floorboards groan under our weight. The sound reminded me of my own rooms, the creak of old timber that accompanies solitude. We descended the staircase in silence, our footsteps echoing faintly. Lewis muttered that the case would resolve itself soon enough. The coroner would pronounce suicide, the college would murmur condolences, life would continue. I said nothing. In my experience, life seldom continues as neatly as institutions would prefer. Outside, the quad lay in darkness, the lamps glowing like islands in a sea of mist. The bells tolled again, distant yet insistent, 4 strokes marking the hour. I thought of the crossword once more. Toll, the missing L, the toll incomplete. Shadows in the common room, shadows in the man's life, shadows in the rain-soaked stones. Oxford is full of shadows, and it is my misfortune to notice them. It was the following afternoon when I found myself back at St. Anselm's, though the rain had given way to a pale autumn sun, weak and reluctant, as if unwilling to intrude on grief. Lewis had arranged for me to meet 2 people, Kynaston's sister-in-law, recently widowed, and a student who had been among the last to speak to him. I confess I approached both conversations with that mixture of detachment and unease that has so often guided me. The living, I find, reveal more of the dead than the dead ever could themselves. The widow arrived first, a small figure draped in a black coat that seemed borrowed from another decade. Her gloves were neatly buttoned, her handbag clasped with fingers that betrayed only the faintest tremor. She spoke softly, as if every word must be weighed against some private ledger of propriety. Adrian was a difficult man, she said. Not unkind, but wrapped in his work like ivy round stone. She had rarely seen him outside of family obligations, and even then his eyes drifted toward thoughts unshared. Yet he had written to her only last week a letter brief but curiously affectionate, remarking on her loneliness since her husband's death. He had invited her to visit, though she had declined. It was the letter that troubled me. Men who prepare for suicide seldom extend invitations. I asked her gently whether she still had it. She nodded, and from her handbag produced a folded sheet, its creases sharp, the ink firm. I read a few lines, noting how deliberate the hand was, each word exact, as though he had meant it to be read carefully. The last sentence lingered. There are bells in Oxford that never let one forget what is lost. A sentiment poetic enough to belong to Kynaston, yet one that deepened rather than resolved the enigma. The widow dabbed her eyes, though no tears fell. She told me he had once courted her, long before she married his brother, but it had come to nothing. He was too distant, too much of a scholar. And yet, she admitted, there had always been a peculiar bond, one that seemed to hover like smoke, never entirely dispersing. She asked me if I believed he had suffered. I replied that I could not yet say. Truthfully, I did not wish to imagine it. Suffering leaves its own echo. I had not heard it in that small, ordered room. After she left, Lewis ushered in the student. He was tall, awkward, his gown crumpled as though it had seen more benches than laundry. He shifted restlessly, uncertain whether he had been summoned as a witness or an accused. He explained that he had attended Kynaston's lectures faithfully, though few did. The old man's voice, he said, carried a strange intensity when he spoke of medieval notions of sin and redemption, as if he believed them not relics but truths still binding. Only last week the student recounted Kynaston had stopped him after class and asked whether he believed bells could absolve guilt. The question had unsettled him. He had mumbled something about symbolism before hurrying away. I pressed him on the details, for guilt is not a word employed without reason. The boy hesitated, then confessed he had seen Kynaston walking near the river the night before his death, though the rain had been heavy. The scholar had been without his satchel, his coat collar turned high. He had seemed lost in thought, murmuring words the student could not hear. I thought again of the dry satchel in his room. If he had left it behind on that walk, why carry it in later? Or was it carried in by another? The student added one final detail. He had glimpsed, tucked in Kynaston's lecture notes, a page of crossword clues written in Latin, the answers altered in pencil. It had seemed odd, but he had thought little of it. I asked what he remembered of the answers. He frowned, then recalled only one, the word peccatum, sin. The clue had been erased and rewritten twice, as though the man could not decide upon its meaning. A hesitation in language, a hesitation in conscience. When the student left, Lewis looked at me with that patient exasperation he reserved for my silences. He said that suicide explained everything more easily than scraps of Latin and unfinished crosswords. Perhaps he was right. Yet I have never trusted the easy explanation. The widow's letter, the student's river sighting, the dry satchel, the missing pipe in the common room, these were not the echoes of a man resigned to death, but the fragments of something obscured. We lingered in the quad as evening fell. The chapel bell rang vespers, the sound carrying long across the rooftops. I recalled the letter's phrase bells that never let one forget. Perhaps they talked for memory, or perhaps for something Kynaston wished to keep hidden. I could not yet know, but in that fading light, with the widow's gloved hands and the student's anxious shifting still in my mind, I felt the shadows lengthen. Oxford had begun to close around me, as it always does when truth hides among its stones, and I, as always, was left listening to echoes. The invitation to take wine in the senior common room came not from courtesy but from necessity. The bursar had insisted, and Lewis, ever inclined toward protocol, had accepted on my behalf before I could decline. And so, as the evening rain brushed against the mullioned windows, I found myself seated beneath portraits of forgotten masters, with a glass of claret resting darkly in my hand. Oxford has many ways of compelling obedience, and a bottle uncorked is one of them. The bursar was joined by two other fellows, a historian of obscure dynasties, and a mathematician whose face seemed etched by long hours of solitary calculation. They spoke with the careful precision of men accustomed to weighing words, though each glance at Lewis suggested a faint irritation that the police had stepped across the threshold of their sanctuary. I have always thought the senior common room a place less of fellowship than of wary coexistence. The claret, however, smoothed their edges, or perhaps only gave the appearance of doing so. I sipped, noting its warmth, its faint bite of earth. Kynaston had not been one for wine. He had once, I was told, refused even port at a Christmas dinner, remarking that indulgence weakened the mind. And yet here were his colleagues, raising glasses as if in silent mockery of his austerity. I asked whether any of them had seen him the day before his death. The historian replied that he had passed Kynaston in the quad, satchel slung heavily at his side, his pace slow, his gaze distracted. The mathematician, more hesitant, admitted he had overheard Kynaston humming in the corridor, a hymn tune, he thought, something plaintive and oddly insistent. Bells again, I wondered, or some private litany. The bursar interrupted to say that Kynaston had lately been reviewing old college accounts, a task that was not his, but which he had undertaken nonetheless. He had seemed troubled by discrepancies, though the bursar dismissed them as clerical untidiness. I watched his hand swirl the wine in his glass, the liquid circling like a quiet accusation. Accounts, discrepancies, and then a sudden death. I stored the thought away, a note left unplayed. Conversation drifted, as it so often does, toward memory. They spoke of Kynaston's lectures, sparsely attended, his voice measured, his eyes fixed always on the text. One recalled his fondness for crosswords, a peculiarity in a man so stern. He would sit at a high table, after dinner, pencil poised, his answers more erudite than witty. Latin clues, Greek puns, references no undergraduate could hope to follow, and yet they said he seemed to take comfort in their completion, as though the world could be arranged into neat columns of certainty. The unfinished puzzle on his desk had disturbed them more than his body. Even in death, Kynaston had broken a habit. Lewis pressed them for detail. Did any know of enemies, debts, hidden affairs? They shook their heads. Kynaston was too remote to invite intimacy, too mild to attract malice. He existed at the margins, they said, like a figure sketched lightly in the background of a larger canvas. Yet I thought of the widow's letter, the student by the river, the crossword left undone. A man at the margins still casts a shadow. I excused myself and wandered to the sideboard where decanters stood like silent sentinels. The labels were neat, the glasses aligned. One place, however, bore a faint ring of wine upon the wood, as though a glass had been set down hastily. The ring was small, the kind left by a sherry rather than claret. I asked who had been drinking sherry. Silence followed. The historian looked at the mathematician who looked at the bursar. None confessed. A small omission, perhaps meaningless, yet its silence seemed louder than any answer. Returning to my chair, I asked whether Kynaston had kept close correspondence. The historian mentioned a few journals, but little beyond. The mathematician, after a pause, recalled seeing Kynaston once with a foreign postmark in hand, staring at it longer than necessary before tucking it deep into his satchel. He could not recall the country, such fragments, a letter, a satchel, a crossword, no more than crumbs on a path, but I felt them begin to align, however faintly. The claret warmed my throat, and I found myself thinking of my own unfinished crosswords, left abandoned in the early hours when whisky blurred the clues. There is something intolerable in an empty square, as though it mocks one's inadequacy. Did Kynaston leave his puzzle incomplete by accident, or was it a deliberate signal, a final silence louder than any word? I could not yet know. The conversation dwindled, the claret bottles standing half-drained. The fellows retreated to their corners, muttering of lectures and obligations. Lewis gave me a look that suggested patience frayed by fatigue. I nodded. There was nothing more to be gained here, at least not openly. As we stepped into the corridor, the boards groaned underfoot, their protest familiar now. I glanced back into the common room. The fire had sunk to ash, the shadows heavy against the portraits, a place of learning, of conviviality, of secrets whispered beneath the rim of a glass. I thought again of the missing pipe I had noticed the night before. Tonight it was back in place on the rack, polished, innocent. Someone had tidied it, or wished it was forgotten. I felt the deduction stir, unfinished, like a word awaiting its final letter. Outside the night was sharp with damp air, the lamps haloed by drizzle. The bells tolled again, slower now, their echo following us across the quad. Lewis muttered something about the futility of wine-soaked memories. I said nothing. For me, the glass of claret had offered not conviviality but a glimpse of shadows, a sherry ring unclaimed, a pipe replaced, a man remembered only in fragments. In such fragments I have often found the truth, though never quickly, and never without cost. And so we left St. Anselm's once more, the echoes of bells trailing after us, the crossword still incomplete, the satchel still too dry. Oxford, as ever, kept its secrets behind closed doors, while the rain began again, soft and insistent, washing the stone clean of answers. The following day was one of those rare Oxford mornings when the mist lifted early, leaving the sky pale and raw, as though scrubbed too clean. I had no appetite for food, only the dull insistence of black coffee to carry me through. Lewis arrived with a folder of papers and the steady look of a man who expects to be contradicted. He told me Kynaston's belongings were to be examined formally and that the college had set aside a small room in the library for the purpose. I knew such undertakings are often tedious receipts, marginalia, unpaid bills, but sometimes, in their dust, a truth stirs. The room allotted was narrow, its windows shuttered against the morning glare. A table stood in the centre, and upon it the contents of Kynaston's life had been arranged in mute procession. Books stacked neatly, envelopes bundled with string, notebooks filled with the careful hand of a man who lived through ink, and photographs, a small tin box of them, their edges curled, their images dim with age. I have always distrusted photographs that suggest permanence, yet lie by omission. They show only what was once visible, not what was thought or concealed. Lewis busied himself with the papers, murmuring occasionally of bank accounts and lecture schedules. I turned instead to the photographs. Most were unremarkable college outings from decades past, a gaunt young man in spectacles who could only have been Kynaston himself, awkward in group portraits, the reluctant smile of one unpractised in society. Others showed anonymous landscapes, ruined abbeys, cloisters in foreign cities, their stones blurred by fading sunlight. And then there was one that caught me, a photograph of two men by the river, both in their 30s, both dressed in the formal ease of the 50s. One was unmistakably Kynaston, his expression more open than in any later likeness. The other to me stood close at his side, their shoulders brushing. There was a warmth in it, subtle but undeniable, the kind of closeness that slips past the eye, unless one is trained to notice. A friendship, perhaps, or something more? I placed the photograph aside and beneath it found another. The same unknown man, seated alone this time, holding a book whose title was obscured. The photograph had been trimmed at its edges, as though cut from a larger whole. Why preserve this fragment? Why conceal the rest? Such acts of curation are never innocent. I asked Lewis whether he recognized the figure. He shook his head, distracted, muttering that the bursar might know. I doubted the bursar would confess to knowing more than he wished. Among the letters bundled with string I found one envelope torn open, its contents missing. The postmark was foreign, French, the year smudged but recent. On the back, in faint pencil, Kynaston had written a single word, souvenir. Was it a reminder or an admonition? I thought of the widow's letter, her mention of a bond never fully extinguished, of a past half forgotten. The foreign letter and the photograph felt like parts of the same puzzle, though which piece belonged where I could not yet tell. Lewis called my attention to a notebook filled with crossword grids, page after page of clues, some in Latin, some in English, all half completed. One entry struck me. Echo of bells, memory retained, 5 letters. He had written toller, not toll, but toller, the Latin imperative, take away. A different resonance altogether, to take away, to remove, to absolve. Was this the missing letter's meaning? The unfinished clue in his last crossword had not been ignorance, but ambiguity, a hesitation between languages, between memory and release. I held the photograph again, the two men by the river. If one were Kynaston and the other the sender of the foreign letter, then perhaps the past had returned, not as memory, but as demand. Oxford remembers, I had thought, but perhaps it is the living who refuse to forget, dragging the dead with them. Lewis urged me to conclude that none of this proved anything. He was right, of course. Photographs are only fragments, letters only hints. Yet I have always trusted fragments over declarations. They whisper where words shout, and it is in whispers that truth most often hides. We left the library room in silence, the photographs returned to their tin, the notebooks stacked once more in order. As we stepped into the main hall, the smell of paper and dust pressed upon me, and I felt that peculiar melancholy of libraries, the sense that every life is already archived, waiting to be interpreted by someone who will misunderstand it. Kynaston's life was no different, though the misunderstanding might yet prove fatal to others. That evening, in my own rooms, I poured whisky and spread the photographs across my desk. The unknown man stared back at me with that faint smile, his eyes alive with something I could not name. I tried to imagine his voice, his presence, his relation to Kynaston. Was he the cause of despair, or its antidote, a friend, a lover, a betrayer? The photographer refused to answer. It only remained mute, unyielding, like the tolling of bells across the night air. Outside, the rain began again, soft against the panes. I traced the faint outline of the cut photograph, the missing edges, the deliberate silence. In crosswords, every blank square demands resolution. In life, the blanks remain, echoing more loudly than the filled. I thought of the Latin word again, tolle, take away, remove. Perhaps someone had taken away more than a photograph's edge. Perhaps someone had taken away Kynaston himself. The bells tolled once more, 11 strokes through the damp air. I listened, glass in hand, the photograph spread before me like evidence in a case too fragile to declare. Each echo seemed to strike deeper than the last. And I knew with the certainty of whisky and silence that the past had not been taken away at all. It lingered, unresolved, within those old photographs, within the college walls, within the unfinished crossword of a man whose secrets had not died with him. It was Lewis who first raised the possibility of a romantic entanglement. He had the hesitant air of a man repeating something heard in whispers, uncertain of its validity, yet unwilling to let it pass unnoticed. There had been talk, he said, of a woman once linked to Kynaston in the distant past, a colleague at another college, though whether it had been affection, courtship, or nothing more than speculation remained unclear. I listened in silence, my instinct already cautioning me that rumours seldom lead to truth, though they can sometimes illuminate the shadows in which truth hides. The woman in question was a lecturer in English literature, now retired, living in a modest terrace off the Iffley Road. We visited her that afternoon, the drizzle returning, as though Oxford had grown weary of clarity. She greeted us at the door with the calm composure of one long accustomed to students and their unsteady demands. Her hair was silver, her eyes sharp, her voice carrying the faint music of Ireland. She invited us into a room lined with books, the scent of tea and paper mingling in the air. I asked if she had known Kynaston well. She smiled at the question, though the smile was brittle. I know him, yes. Understood him, no. Few ever did. They had once taken walks together along the river, she said, in those early years when possibilities still hovered around their lives. He spoke rarely of himself, preferring medieval texts, as if the past could stand in for confession. There had been affection, perhaps even warmth, but it had cooled swiftly into the distance. He was a man bound by solitude. She married another, and, whatever bond remained, was one of occasional correspondence, never intimacy. She poured tea, her hand steady. She told us she had seen him not long ago passing on the high street, his satchel pressed close to his side. He had not stopped, merely nodded, as though reluctant to disturb the silence between them. She had thought nothing of it until news of his death arrived. Suicide, they said. She shook her head. She could not imagine him surrendering so deliberately. He had always been a man of routine, of order, of stubborn endurance. His end, she implied, did not fit the man she remembered. Lewis asked the questions of procedure. Had she written to him? Had he confided in her? She answered with patience, but the answers were negative. No letters in recent years, no confidences exchanged. Only that brief glimpse on the high street and the memory of walks long past. I watched her carefully as she spoke. There was no sign of grief, only a quiet resignation. Whatever bond had once existed had dissolved into dust long before his death. She offered nothing more than a shadow of a life already shadowed. And yet, as we left, she pressed a small book into my hand, a slim volume of verse, inscribed on its fly-leaf, "For A, in Friendship, 1962. The handwriting was Kynaston's, neat, restrained, unadorned. She said he had given it to her when they first met, and she thought perhaps it should return to him now, or at least to those who carried his name into the record of death. I thanked her, though the weight of the book in my coat pocket felt heavier than its size. A gesture of sentiment or of irony. I could not yet tell. That evening, back in my room, I opened the book. The poems were earnest, unremarkable. But tucked between its pages was a slip of paper, browned with age, bearing in faint pencil a crossword clue: love's deception, false lead, 7 letters. The answer written beside it is Redare. The final 2 letters are missing, as though abandoned mid-thought. A red herring of romance, unfinished, unconfirmed. The irony was almost too pointed. Had Kynaston himself labelled his past affections as nothing more than a diversion, a clue leading nowhere? I considered the possibility. A romantic entanglement, real or imagined, could provide motive for despair, but the clue suggested otherwise. He had seen it himself as false, incomplete, not worth finishing. The widow had spoken of a bond, the student of guilt, the fellows of distraction. Yet this woman, this colleague, offered only a memory of something that had never taken root. It was a story convenient to tell, but one that rang hollow against the harder fragments I had already gathered. Lewis, when I showed him the paper, shrugged. He said it proved nothing, only that Kynaston enjoyed wordplay even in his youth. Perhaps so, but I have learned that the mind reveals itself most clearly in its smallest notations, in the unfinished word, the hesitation of a pencil. The missing O and G in herring were as eloquent to me as a confession. A romance began, perhaps, but never completed, a false trail, and Kynaston knew it. The bells tolled again outside, 9 strokes through the wet night. I set the book aside, poured whisky, and stared at the paper, a red herring of romance, left deliberately incomplete. It was not love that had undone him, of that I felt certain. Something else lingered, something harder, less forgiving. The foreign letter, the photograph of the unknown man, the satchel too dry, the pipe replaced on its rack. These were not the echoes of affection, but of concealment. Oxford lay quiet beyond the glass, the stones gleaming with rain, the cloisters breathing their secrets. I thought of the woman on Iffley Road, her steady hands, her calm denial. She had lived her life and moved on. Kynaston had not. He had remained among the stones, haunted by echoes, by fragments left unfinished. Romance was a convenient story, but it was only a red herring, and I, whether I wished it or not, was still following the toll of the bells into darker corridors. It was late when Lewis and I returned to St. Anselm's library. The college had agreed, somewhat reluctantly, to allow me another look at Kynaston's papers, though the porter made it clear the key must be returned by midnight. We stepped into the cloister, where the stones shone slick beneath a fine drizzle. The lamps along the quad cast their dim circles, but the library itself loomed darker, as if withholding whatever truths it housed. Oxford libraries have always unsettled me. They smell of permanence, but their silence is not the silence of peace, it is the silence of things waiting. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and polish. Tall cases stretched upward, their spines serried like soldiers, though the books themselves were long retired from battle. The only light came from a single green-shaded lamp on the central table. It left the corners of the room thick with shadow. Lewis muttered about the impracticality of such gloom, but for me the dimness was familiar, almost comforting. Secrets prefer the half-lit. We spread Kynaston's papers across the table once more, letters, notebooks, photographs, and then, almost by accident, I noticed a folder I had not seen before, a plain manila cover tucked behind the others, as though pushed there hastily. Inside lay a manuscript Latin, carefully copied in Kynaston's precise hand, with marginal notes in English. The text, as far as I could judge, was a medieval homily, though with curious interpolations, words underlined, phrases marked with asterisks, as if he had been searching for something not yet clear. The recurring word struck me as peccatum, sin. Each time circled, as though the man could not leave it alone. Lewis leaned over my shoulder, frowning. He said it meant nothing more than scholarship, the kind Kynaston lived for. But the marginal notes told another story. In one corner, he had written in English, bells, remission, absolution, memory, another note. The sound does not cleanse, it binds. These were not the thoughts of detached scholarship. They were confessions written in another man's words. Among the manuscript pages I found a loose sheet, folded twice. It was a crossword grid, the squares filled in with unusual neatness. The central clue caught my eye, unforgiven memory, 5 letters. He had written sinner, not the common spelling, but the archaic form double N, as in the manuscripts he studied. A detail too small for most to notice, but not for me. He was playing with language, but perhaps also trapped by it, as if the past could only be understood through variations of the same word. Sin, peccatum, sinner. The word repeated until it lost meaning, and yet gained it. I stared at that grid for longer than I care to admit. It reminded me of how often a crossword demands not the obvious answer, but the old one, the archaic, the forgotten. Kynaston had been circling not simply the idea of sin, but its echoes through time. Why? Was it guilt? Or was it merely an obsession? With him, the two were indistinguishable. The library creaked around us, the timbers settling with the damp. I felt the peculiar sensation that we were not alone, perhaps only the porter making his rounds, perhaps nothing at all. Yet Oxford has a way of filling silence with presence. I asked Lewis if the fellows had mentioned any disputes, professional or otherwise. He said none. Kynaston was too quiet to quarrel. And yet men who leave unfinished crosswords, cryptic notes and circled sins do not die without some quarrel, if not with others, then with themselves. I leafed further through the manuscript. A page caught my attention, a marginal note written not in Kynaston's usual hand, but in a shakier, heavier script. It read, "Souviens-toi, remember." The French word echoed the postmark I had seen on the missing letter. Why had he written it here, in a text otherwise Latin and English? Or was it another's hand added later? The ink looked different, darker, as though written with less care. Lewis dismissed it as an old annotation. But I knew Kynaston's precision was not his line. Someone else had touched these pages. We closed the folder at last, but the thought lingered. A manuscript copied obsessively, the word sin circled endlessly, the intrusion of another hand whispering remember. And beside it, The crossword clue, the archaic spelling of sin. A man caught between languages, between memory and guilt, between absolution and its impossibility. When we stepped out into the quad, the drizzle had thickened, the stones gleaming underfoot. The chapel bell struck 10, each stroke carrying into the mist. I thought of Kynaston's note, "The sound does not cleanse, it binds." He had heard in those bells not freedom, but fetters. Perhaps that was the heart of it. He was bound, not absolved. Lewis walked ahead, his shoulders hunched against the rain. I lingered a moment longer, staring back at the Gaiety library windows, dark now, indifferent. Somewhere within lay the manuscript, the circled words, the crossword grids, the foreign annotation. Fragments, each incomplete. Like a puzzle waiting for the final square, the missing letter, the word that would unlock the rest. I lit a cigarette, though I had promised myself I would not. The smoke curled upward, dissolving in the damp. I thought of the word again since. Old, awkward, unresolved, like Oxford itself, like the case itself. And so the bells tolled again, and I followed their echo into the night, the manuscript heavy in my mind, its pages whispering a story I could almost hear, but not yet name. I have often thought that words, more than deeds, betray us. A man may guard his gestures, compose his face, still his hands. But language spoken, scribbled, half-finished, slips through the cracks. Kynaston's life seemed to me increasingly less a series of actions than a web of phrases, notes, marginalia, clues left in half-lit corners. The more I read them, the less I understood him, and yet the more certain I became that whatever had undone him was hidden in language itself. That evening I sat alone with his notebooks, the claret of the night before still lingering in my throat. The library had permitted me to take a small stack for closer inspection. Lewis had gone home, muttering about his children's school reports, and I was left with silence. The rain pressed against the windows in gentle insistence, and the lamplight cast each page into fragile relief. I turned slowly, my eyes catching on the repeated phrases he had underlined, circled, annotated. Bells, remembrance, absolution. Always the same triad, as though the man were trapped in his own echo chamber. One page caught me, not for what was written, but for how it had been written. The line began in Latin, memento peccati member sin. But midway the script shifted into English, then back again, as if the languages had warred in his mind. At the margin he had penciled a faint anagram, stolen time. The letters fitted neatly, too neatly to be accidental. I rearranged them absent-mindedly, my mind slipping into the mechanical pleasure of crosswords, limestone, molten ties. Yet it was the original that troubled me most. Stolen time? Had he believed his life was borrowed, or another's taken? I thought of the torn page found near the garden gate, with its faint words bell, steadfast, toll. The phrase and the fragment belonged to one another. One a clue, the other an answer, perhaps. The echo of bells was no metaphor for him. It was literal, insistent, the sound of something unresolved. Perhaps he heard in every toll the reminder of what he had stolen or lost. I closed the notebook and let the silence gather. The floorboards creaked above me, some neighbour shifting in his chair, or perhaps the house itself reminding me of its age. I poured whiskey and let the glass rest untouched beside me. My eyes drifted to the crossword in his last days, that half-written toll, toller, take away. Each version of the word is a puzzle in itself. Was he pleading for release or confessing to theft? A phrase left incomplete is more dangerous than one spoken outright. Earlier that afternoon I had returned to the widow under the pretext of clarifying the date of his last letter. She had spoken little, though her hands betrayed more than her words. When I mentioned the phrase souvenir scrawled on the missing letter's envelope, she stiffened just slightly. She said she did not speak French, that the word meant nothing to her. Yet I saw the tremor in her gloved fingers as she poured tea. She had understood more than she wished to admit. Souvenir. Remember, always the same imperative. Remember, remember, the bells, the manuscripts, the phrase in another's hand. Was all of Oxford conspiring to remind him of something he could not endure? I asked her if she had ever heard him speak of time stolen. She looked away, then said softly that he had once referred to a friendship in his youth as something that had cost him dearly. She had assumed he meant years lost to distraction. But perhaps not. Perhaps he had meant it more literally, as if those hours had been illicit, borrowed from a life that should not have been his. She did not continue, and I did not press her. But the phrase had embedded itself too firmly in my mind. When I returned to my rooms that night, the crossword grids spread across my desk like a second life awaiting completion. I noticed something I had overlooked. At the bottom of one page, beneath the clues, he had penciled another phrase, then rubbed it nearly clean. The erasure had left faint ghosts of letters, visible only in slanting light. I leaned closer, tracing them silently until the words emerged. The last bell is not the end, a contradiction of every church sermon he had ever read, and yet his own truth. It explained nothing, yet darkened everything. Lewis would have called it self-indulgent rambling, the tortured notes of a scholar who had spent too long alone with his text. Perhaps it was. And yet I have always trusted the unfinished, the erased, the almost forgotten. They tell us what men fear to say aloud. To me, the puzzle in Kynaston's phrases spoke more loudly than the evidence in his room. A satchel too dry, a pipe replaced, a letter missing. These were shadows, but words, remember, toll, stolen time, these were echoes that refused to fade. The bells rang again, then midnight across the city. I set down my pen and listened. Their sound did not cleanse. It is bound. Bound me, perhaps, as much as it had bound him. Each toll a square in the crossword, each echo a reminder that the final word had not yet been filled. I wondered whether it ever would be, or whether Kynaston had intended it as an unfinished puzzle, a phrase left hovering to trouble those of us who came after. I drained the glass at last, the whisky dull against the sharpness of the rain. Oxford lay. Outside, stone and silence, the air damp with memory. And within me the phrase repeated itself, insistent, unsolved stolen time. Perhaps that was all any of us had. Perhaps that was all he meant to tell me. A clue too simple, too ambiguous, too final, and yet still incomplete. It is always too tempting to seize upon the first answer that fits the surface of the puzzle. One can align the letters neatly, fill the squares with convincing certainty, and admire the symmetry of completion. Yet beneath that surface lies the quiet unease of an error disguised as truth. I knew this as well as any man, and yet I allowed myself, for one evening, to believe that Kynaston's death had arranged itself into the form of a simple word, suicide. The coroner's preliminary note had reached Lewis that morning. Cyanide poisoning, no sign of struggle. Circumstances consistent with self-administered dose. I could almost hear the finality in the dry, bureaucratic tone. Lewis repeated it to me in his measured way, as though by pronouncing the official version he could close the matter. And I, tired of fragments and echoes, almost let myself accept it. Almost. We walked through the drizzle toward the Sheldonian, our coats damp, our shoes glistening. Lewis spoke of paperwork, of the widow's relief that an inquest might be swift, of the college's desire for quiet resolution. I listened, nodding, though my thoughts drifted elsewhere. The widow's letter, the foreign postmark, the photograph of the unknown manor could be dismissed as irrelevant if one wished. The crossword's unfinished toll could be written off as a scholar's final weariness. The satchel was too dry, the pipe replaced small contradictions, no more, if one wished. That afternoon I sat in the Bodleian, the rain streaking the high windows. I opened one of Kynaston's notebooks, more from habit than conviction, and my eyes settled on a phrase I had not noticed before. False key, false door, written in a hurried scrawl at the edge of a crossword grid. The words struck me like the misfit letter in a supposedly solved clue. What if the solution I was settling on was the false one? What if suicide was not the answer but merely the word that happened to fit? A word too easy, too neat. I recalled the photograph again of the man by the river, his shoulder brushing Kynaston's, his face warm, in a way Kynaston's never was. A fragment of intimacy cut from the rest of the picture. And the foreign letter, missing from its envelope, marked a souvenir. To remember, to bind, to accuse. Suicide explained none of these. It was, I realized, not a solution, but a distraction, the way a crossword setter tempts the solver with the plausible but wrong. Lewis joined me in the reading room, his boots squeaking faintly against the polished floor. He asked if I was finished with my notes. I told him perhaps, though my tone betrayed doubt. He frowned, and in his silence I heard his patience wearing thin. He wanted resolution, not riddles, but riddles were all Kynaston had left us, riddles and bells. Later, in my own rooms, I poured whiskey and spread the clues before me like tiles of a mosaic. Widow's bond, student's river sighting, foreign letter, manuscript's French annotation, the crossword's unfinished toll. Each could be ignored, dismissed, explained away. Together, however, they refused to settle. They shifted restlessly like words that almost but not quite the grid. Suicide might be the neat word, but it was the wrong one, the false solution. I thought again of the anagram he had scribbled, stolen time. It nagged at me. If time was stolen, then by whom? By Kynaston, or from him? The bells did not cleanse their bound. What memory had bound him so fiercely? The widow's tremor at the word souvenir suggested she knew more than she admitted. The fellow's evasions over the missing sherry glass and pipe told me the college itself was reluctant to reveal its secrets. And the student's remark, Kynaston, asking if bells could absolve guilt, echoed louder now than the tolling across the city. The rain thickened outside, the windows rattling faintly in their frames. I felt the old ache in my chest, the weariness of one who has followed too many false leads. Yet the puzzle's unease would not let me rest. Suicide was too smooth, too official, too convenient. Kynaston had left us unfinished phrases, erased words, missing letters. He wanted us to know, or at least to doubt. And so I doubted. I returned to the crossword page where he had written toll, a word incomplete. Toll, the sound of bells, toll, the Latin for takeaway. Or perhaps something else. Another word could be made. He had told us, perhaps in fragments, too scattered to read, told us that his death was not his own, told us that memory had returned, unwelcome, told us that the false solution would not suffice. The bells rang again across the night, heavy, deliberate. I listened, and in their echo I heard not closure but persistence. Each stroke is another reminder that Oxford remembers and that Kynaston's puzzle was not yet solved. Suicide was the word the coroner would write, the fellows would accept, the widow would fold into her grief, but I, alone with the whiskey and the rain, knew better. It was the false solution, the neat answer that concealed the truth. And so I sat, the clock striking 1, the papers scattered, the whiskey glass empty. Outside, the rain beat steadily against the stone. Inside, the words circled endlessly. Toll, toll, told. Stolen time. Souvenir. Remember, a puzzle of phrases, each incomplete, each refusing to yield. I knew then that the real answer lay elsewhere, still hidden, still waiting, and I, however weary, would have to find it. Morning came reluctantly, the light weak, strained through a veil of cloud that left the city looking bruised. I had slept little, my head too full of half-formed words, unfinished crosswords, echoes of bells that would not release me. Lewis appeared with his usual blend of fatigue and perseverance, a man tethered to duty more than curiosity. He told me that the college fellows had agreed to one final conversation in the senior common room. I followed him through the damp streets, though in truth I wanted little more than silence and a glass of whisky. But Oxford seldom grants men what they want. It grants them reminders. The common room was quiet when we entered. The fire burned higher than usual, the air heavy with smoke and sherry. The bursar was there, and with him 2 fellows I had not yet met, a philosopher with a mane of white hair, and a chemist whose spectacles seemed to fog perpetually. They stood by the sideboard, glasses in hand. Lewis exchanged pleasantries. I wandered toward the window where the rain left its slow inscriptions. It was then I saw a glass half full, set apart from the others, rim stained faintly crimson, not clear. Something darker? Port, perhaps, or something else. I asked whose glass it was. The question was met with silence, then a shrug from the philosopher. He thought it belonged to Kynaston, left here weeks ago, though he could not be sure. The bursar, sharper, said Kynaston never drank port. He was right, I remembered. A man of abstinence. Yet here was the glass, its stain indelible on the rim, a contradiction left in plain sight, ignored by those accustomed to ignoring. I felt again the tightening in my mind, the small turn of deduction. If the glass was his, he had broken his pattern. If not his, someone wished it to appear so. Either way, it spoke. And in Oxford, objects speak more truth than men. Lewis began his questioning times, dates, observations. I let my gaze drift back to the mantel, where the pipes rested once again in their rack. All present this time, polished, innocuous. I recalled the missing one from that earlier night, the sherry ring on the sideboard. Each detail minor, forgettable. Yet puzzles are built from such fragments. I thought of the words written faintly in Kynaston's notebook. False key, false door. The false solution I had almost accepted. Perhaps this glass was the key. Perhaps the phrase was not metaphor, but instruction. The chemist cleared his throat and mentioned, almost reluctantly, that he had once seen Kynaston in the laboratory years ago, borrowing texts on compounds rarely used in theology. He thought little of it at the time. Cyanide, after all, was no stranger to chemistry. The comment was left hanging, the fellows shifting uneasily. I watched their discomfort. The mention of poison in a room where men raised glasses so easily seemed almost indecent. I thought of the crimson stain again, the rim unwashed, left as if to accuse. Suicide or not, the glass suggested participation. Someone had shared a drink with him, or left behind the suggestion of it. When we stepped into the corridor afterward, Lewis asked if I believed the glass was important. I told him everything was important until it proved otherwise. He sighed and said that there was no answer. But answers, I reminded myself, are often the false solutions. It is the clues that matter, the fragments that refuse to fade. He shook his head, weary, but said no more. That night, alone once again, I laid the photograph on my desk beside the glass I had taken from the common room, permitted reluctantly by the bursar, who seemed glad to see it gone. I set them side by side, the unknown man's smile beside the rim's crimson trace. Both were fragments of intimacy, half hidden, half revealed. I tried to imagine the scene of Kynaston seated in that solemn room, lifting a glass he should never have touched. Alone or accompanied? A toast? A ritual? A farewell? The puzzle would not settle. I turned again to his crosswords, leafing through pages of grids. One clue stopped me cold. Scholar's measure, final draft, 5 letters. He had written glass, completed for once with no ambiguity. Scholar's glass. Was it metaphor or was it literal? A man who drank nothing, leaving behind a glass stained in red. A man whose puzzles always circled back to bells, remembrance, sin, now to glass. I stared until the letters blurred. Glass. His last word or another's insertion. The bells struck midnight, deep and mournful. I poured whiskey and raised it, half in toast, half in resignation. The glass caught the lamplight, its rim glowing faintly, accusatory. I thought of the widow, her tremor at the word souvenir. I thought of the student by the river, uneasy with what he had seen. I thought of the photograph, the foreign letter, the manuscript annotated in another's hand. And I thought of the glass, left behind, marked, unclaimed. Each fragment another toll of the bell, another reminder that the solution I sought would not come neatly. I drained my whiskey and set the glass down beside the crossword. Glass. The word stared back at me, both answer and question. The scholar's glass. Perhaps it was the last truth Kynaston left us, or perhaps another false solution, another phrase designed to bind rather than release. I did not know. I only knew that Oxford remembered and that the bells would ring again, calling me back into their echo. And so the night ended, and with it the scholar's glass, still gleaming faintly on my desk as if waiting for me to see what I had not yet seen. The case closed itself as they often do, not with revelation, but with exhaustion. Papers signed, verdict delivered, silence restored. The coroner's word hung over everything suicide. Lewis accepted it, the college accepted it, even the widow with her gloves and tremor seemed relieved enough to fold herself back into mourning without further interrogation. Oxford thrives on quiet endings, and scandal unsettles its stones. And so the bells tolled, and the world moved on, at least outwardly. I could not. Nights lingered heavy, the aftertaste of whiskey sharper than usual. I found myself turning again to the fragments spread across my desk, the crossword grids, the torn scrap from the garden, the photograph of 2 men by the river. They were not evidence in any formal sense. They were whispers, nothing more. Yet it is the whispers that trouble the mind long after official voices fall silent. One evening I walked alone through the cloisters of St. Anselm's. The rain had stopped, leaving the air brittle and clean. My steps echoed against the stone, unaccompanied. I paused by the chapel, its doors shut, its bells dormant for once. There, in the hush, I thought of the note Kynaston had left in his manuscript. The sound does not cleanse, it binds. He had known it, perhaps more deeply than any of us. Oxford remembers, yes, but it also binds. And what had bound him in the end, none of us had truly seen. I returned to my rooms, poured claret this time instead of whiskey, and stared into the dark liquid, the scholar's glass. The rim of the abandoned port glass haunted me still. Whose lips had touched it? His, breaking his lifelong abstinence? Or another's, leaving behind the faint trace of company never acknowledged? It would never be answered, not now. Yet the image remained. A man does not live by silence alone. Even Kynaston, severe, solitary, had left the faintest trace of intimacy behind. And perhaps that was what had undone him, not sin, not scholarship, but the memory of closeness never fully claimed. I leafed once more through his final crossword. That unfinished clue, unyielding bell sound, 4 letters, toll, the absence of the final L mocked me. Toll, yes, but also the toll taken away, or told. He had told us something in his silence, in his unfinishedness. He had left us with the discomfort of incompleteness. Perhaps that was his last act of resistance against the tidy verdicts of institutions, refusal to finish the puzzle, refusal to let the story close. Lewis came by one night, his coat wet with drizzle, his patience worn. He said gently that I must let it rest. The college wished for peace, the widow wished for quiet, and the police had other cases. He placed his hand on the crossword page as though to press it shut. I poured him a glass and said nothing. In time he left, shaking his head, his loyalty stretched thin but unbroken. Alone again, I gathered the papers back into their box. The fragments no longer belonged to inquiry. They belonged to memory. And yet, even as I closed the box, a final detail returned. In the crossword, with the archaic spelling sin, the clue had been 5 across unforgiven memory, 5 letters. He had written sinner, but the square allowed only 5. He had crammed 6 letters into 5 boxes, as though refusing the limit. The grid did not permit it, but he forced it anyway. A false solution, or perhaps a true one that could not be contained. It was his last gesture, I thought, to leave behind something that would not fit, that would never be reconciled. The bells struck midnight. I raised the claret glass, the aftertaste, soft, lingering, almost sweet, the quiet aftertaste. That was what remained of Kynaston's life, not verdicts, not resolutions, but an aftertaste, a faint flavour of something unfinished, something stubbornly incomplete. It lingered in the air of the college, in the widow's tremor, in the student's unease, in the photograph's cropped edge. It lingered in me, more than I cared to admit. I set the glass down and turned out the lamp. In the dark, Oxford seemed to breathe around me, its stones heavy with remembrance. Perhaps suicide had been the word the world accepted. Perhaps it was true. But in the silence after the bells, in the quiet aftertaste of wine and memory, I could not believe it was the only word. The puzzle remained incomplete. And I, for all my weariness, knew I would carry its echo long after the college had forgotten.